This is a piece of racing history here in Daytona Beach. The last part of famed NASCAR mechanic Smokey Yunick's garage was gutted by fire tonight and is being called suspicious.
Picture a locked garage in Daytona Beach, untouched for years, owned by a man NASCAR once called too dangerous to compete against. Now picture that garage finally opening its doors to the public. What came out of it wasn't a secret government file or a hidden vault of banned technology. It was something stranger, something more human, and something that still quietly outperforms the legend built around it. This is the true story of what was actually found inside Smokey Yunick's garage, and why the real discovery turned out to be far more interesting than the myth. For decades, gearheads have whispered about Smokey Yunick's Daytona Beach shop like it was some kind of forbidden laboratory, a place where NASCAR officials supposedly wanted certain things to disappear forever. The truth is almost the opposite. When Smokey passed away on May 9, 2001, at 77 years old, after a long fight with leukemia, his family didn't seal the building or quietly hand it over to a museum. They opened the doors to the public. Anyone could walk in. Anyone could buy a piece of it. And that single decision tells you more about who Smokey Yunick really was than any conspiracy theory ever could. The building itself sat at 957 North Beach Street, a plain, unassuming structure that Smokey had opened way back in 1947. Over the following 4 decades, it earned a nickname that stuck for good: the best damn garage in town. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a workshop where some of the most inventive and most controversial ideas in American motorsports were born. Smokey closed the place in 1987, reportedly because he felt there simply weren't enough good mechanics left to justify keeping it running. 4 years after that, the garage sat mostly frozen in time, filled with tools, half-finished projects, and machines that told the story of a man who never stopped tinkering. When his widow, Marge Yunick, opened the contents to the public during Speed Weeks in February 2002, the response was massive. Fans traveled from states as far away as Maine and Oregon just to walk through the space and take home a piece of it. What they found wasn't a secret laboratory guarded by conspiracy. It was a working shop, exactly the way you'd expect a lifelong mechanic space to look. There were $5 fender hammers sitting next to boxes of race car parts selling for $20. Stacks of old hubcaps and exhaust pipes lined the walls. A vintage 1950s GMC dealership sign hung nearby, alongside Smokey's own well-worn manual typewriter, the same one he likely used to draft technical notes and stubborn letters to rulebook officials for years. And then, mixed in among all of that ordinary clutter, sat something extraordinary: a hand-built engine with a tag claiming it could deliver 80 miles per gallon. The asking price was $20,000. Most people walking past probably assumed it was an exaggeration, a garage sale legend dressed up to justify the price tag. It wasn't. Marge Yunick summed up the entire event with a line that's stuck with fans ever since. She said something along the lines of, "They were like a junkyard, but a first-class junkyard." That phrase captures the whole spirit of the place. It wasn't polished. It wasn't curated for a museum display case. It was real, lived in, and packed with genuine value hiding inside the mess. According to the family, this was exactly what Smokey would have wanted. He didn't want his tools and parts sitting behind glass, untouched, admired from a distance by people who never turned a wrench. He wanted them back in the hands of fans and mechanics who would actually use them, who would treat them like living pieces of his legacy instead of frozen museum relics. That philosophy made sense once you understood how Smokey approached machines throughout his entire life. He spent years rescuing forgotten and broken-down machinery, restoring it, and putting it back to work. He wasn't interested in wealthy collectors locking his life's achievements away in a private trophy room. The proceeds from the sale went toward a foundation meant to support innovation in motorsports, carrying forward the same spirit of experimentation that had defined his entire career. His daughter, Trish Yunick Brown, later admitted that while plenty of people showed up wanting the physical objects, the thing she personally valued most wasn't a tool or an engine. It was his stories. Her husband, Chris Brown, described Smokey using a nickname that racing fans instantly recognized: NASCAR's wildest cheater. But that wasn't really an insult. It was almost a badge of honor. It described a man who constantly discovered legal gray areas in the rulebook, forcing officials to rewrite the rules again and again just to keep up with him. So instead of secret raids or midnight seizures by NASCAR officials, the real unveiling of Smokey Yunick's garage was refreshingly ordinary. It was a public sale where regular fans could walk out with a $5 hammer sitting on the same table as a machine that had pushed automotive engineering years ahead of its time. Even after the property itself was eventually sold in 2003, and the remaining building was destroyed in a fire on April 25, 2011, the real legacy of that garage had already scattered across the country, sitting in private collections, workshops, and museum displays far beyond Daytona Beach. Now here's where the story gets genuinely wild, because tucked among all those ordinary tools were engines that Detroit's own engineers had once tested, verified, and then walked away from anyway. The most remarkable of these were what became known as the hot vapor engines, and unlike some of Smokey's more mythical inventions, these ones actually survived intact. While most modern engines rely on computers to precisely manage fuel delivery, Smokey took a completely different route using something surprisingly old-school: heat. He built his most famous version around a modified 2.5-liter Pontiac Fiero Iron Duke four-cylinder engine. In its stock factory form, that engine produced around 90 horsepower and returned roughly 35 miles per gallon on the highway, which was already respectable for its era. Smokey's carbureted version of that same engine produced 250 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque. That's an almost unbelievable jump for essentially the same displacement. It dropped the 0 to 60 time down to roughly 6.5 seconds, all while still managing 51 miles per gallon running on 93-octane fuel. How did he pull that off? The technical name for his approach is adiabatic combustion. In plain terms, instead of cooling down the incoming air and fuel mixture the way most engines do, Smokey used waste heat, the kind normally lost through the exhaust and coolant system, to actually boil the fuel mixture before it entered the cylinders. The mixture was routed through an exhaust-driven turbine, sometimes called a homogenizer, positioned beneath the carburetor. From there, it passed through a specially wrapped manifold until it reached temperatures exceeding 450 degrees Fahrenheit. That intense heat completely vaporized the fuel, which allowed the engine to run on an extremely lean air-to-fuel ratio, more than 20 parts air to every 1 part fuel. For comparison, most gasoline engines run closer to 14.7 to 1. The origins of this idea actually stretch back even further, all the way to the 1950s, when Smokey worked alongside a Holley carburetor expert and General Motors dyno technician named Ralph Johnson. Together, the two of them figured out how to push combustion past the normal detonation threshold, running exhaust temperatures around 2250 degrees to carefully control the hydrogen burn happening inside the cylinders. Johnson later described their lean burn calibration in a way that perfectly captures the razor's edge they were working on, essentially saying that the engine never ran better than right before it was about to fail. That's the kind of statement that tells you exactly how far these two men were willing to push the boundaries of what an engine could handle. Over the years, Smokey and his collaborators built several hot vapor prototypes beyond that famous Fiero. There was a 3-cylinder Bic, a modified Ford, and even a Dodge Omni. Each of these test vehicles exceeded 45 miles per gallon and produced nearly 2 horsepower for every cubic inch of displacement, numbers that would still turn heads today, let alone decades ago. At one point, the technology came remarkably close to reaching production. There was serious interest around an S10 truck project, and even a licensing deal discussion with crane cams. But in the end, the technology never made it to dealership lots. It collapsed under a mix of durability concerns, mounting legal fees, high manufacturing costs, and what people in the industry often call not invented here syndrome, meaning big manufacturers were hesitant to adopt a groundbreaking idea that hadn't originated inside their own engineering departments. What made this even more impressive is that Detroit's own labs and original equipment engineers actually verified these numbers themselves. The engine met strict 1980s emission standards without using a single computer chip to manage the process. That's a staggering achievement for an era when electronic engine management was still in its infancy for most manufacturers. But here's the important part. Even though the technology never reached mass production, the physical engines themselves survived. Smokey's daughter Trish kept 4 of the prototype engines within the family. Meanwhile, an enthusiast named Tony Allers eventually acquired the running examples and built a beautifully restored, genuinely Daler-driven Fiero using the salvaged original drivetrain. He drove that car for years, treating it not as a museum piece but as a working vehicle, exactly the way Smokey would have wanted. On Christmas Day in 2009, Allers donated that very car to the Don Garlett's Museum of Drag Racing, where it remains on display today. Another one of the surviving units is reportedly held on long-term loan at the Smithsonian Institution. Think about that for a moment. A carbureted 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine, built in someone's private garage, hit 250 horsepower and 51 miles per gallon back in the 1980s, all while meeting strict federal emission standards. And it still ended up gathering dust in a warehouse simply because it didn't come from inside the walls of a major manufacturer. As incredible as those engines were, they represent only one part of what Smokey left behind. He also spent decades filing patents covering everything from fuel conditioning systems to oil change methods, engine testing procedures, and even racetrack safety barriers. These documents reveal a man who wasn't just tinkering for fun in his spare time. He was systematically documenting ideas that the racing world often refused to take seriously until years, sometimes decades, later. Patents are essentially a legal timestamp, official proof of exactly when an idea was born. According to United States Patent and Trademark Office records, Smokey secured at least 9 patents between 1978 and 1996. Several of these were directly tied to his hot vapor engine research, covering the specific apparatus, operating methods, and fuel conditioning systems that powered his modified Fire-O. Those particular patents entered the public domain around 2003, meaning engineers and researchers today can study the technology freely without worrying about licensing restrictions. Beyond the hot vapor patents, Smokey also registered a pressure vent design in 1978, an oil change system patent in 1991, and an engine testing method patent in 1994. But some of his most frustrating battles weren't over engine technology at all. They were over safety. Back in 1961, Smokey developed pneumatic air jacks designed to lift stock cars almost instantly during pit stops, cutting down valuable seconds during a race. NASCAR rejected the idea outright, calling it inappropriate for the series at the time. The following year, he mounted a massive wing over the engine of Jim Rathman's Simone's Vista Special Watson Roadster for the Indianapolis 500. That wing generated an incredible amount of downforce, dramatically improving cornering speed. Unfortunately, it also created significant drag down the straightaways, and the United States Auto Club banned it almost immediately. Decades later, of course, wings became not just accepted, but mandatory standard equipment across Can-Am racing, Formula One, and IndyCar. Smokey had simply been about 20 years ahead of the rulebook. Perhaps the most sobering example involves safety barriers. In the early 1980s, long before anything resembling the modern safer barrier existed, Smokey designed a primitive soft wall concept. It used old tires sandwiched between heavy sheets of plywood, meant to absorb impact energy during a crash. NASCAR didn't adopt the idea at the time, and drivers continued racing against solid concrete walls for years afterward. Smokey eventually formalized his research into a 1996 patent specifically covering a racetrack design with a novel crash barrier system. It's worth sitting with that fact for a moment. A working safety concept existed in someone's private garage more than a decade before the sport widely adopted anything similar. Patents and rejected safety innovations tell one part of the story, the part where Smokey was working quietly behind the scenes. But nowhere is his reputation for bending the rules more visible than in the legendary 7/8 scale Chevelle, a car that's become one of the most misunderstood legends in NASCAR history. The photo that still circulates online shows Smokey standing beside that Chevelle, cigar in mouth and a crooked grin on his face. It's almost always captioned as the car built at 7/8 scale to fool NASCAR inspectors. Except the actual measurements completely destroy that version of the story. A literal 7/8 scale car would have been nearly 10 inches narrower than a standard Chevelle, more than 2 feet shorter overall, and built on a wheelbase of roughly 100 inches. A difference that dramatic would have been immediately obvious to anyone who simply walked past it in the garage. Nobody would have needed measuring tools to spot it. The real story is far more subtle, and honestly, far more impressive from an engineering standpoint. It involved 3 Chevelles with 1966 bodies, often mistakenly referred to as 1967 models in retellings of the legend. These cars started with legitimate developmental work already done by Chevrolet's own engineering team, and Smokey simply took that foundation and refined it with meticulous precision. The real modifications came down to carefully calculated aerodynamic shifts. He moved the body roughly 2 inches backward on the chassis to improve overall weight distribution. He smoothed out and slightly raised the floor pan to better manage airflow underneath the car. He subtly lowered the roofline and windows, raked the windshield back at a sharper angle, and made small alterations to the fenders and drip rails. He even modified the front bumper, making it taller so it functioned almost like an aerodynamic spoiler. The sheet metal itself stayed largely stock. What changed was the underlying geometry, sculpted piece by piece to cut through the air more efficiently. At speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour, those small aerodynamic adjustments translate into a massive real-world advantage. When NASCAR inspectors eventually realized something wasn't adding up, they scrambled to create their very first set of body templates, using a wrecked Chevelle previously driven by Bobby Johns as their reference pattern. The process caused chaos during inspections and ultimately forced NASCAR to mandate standardized roof, hood, and trunk templates across the entire field, a system that, in modified form, still exists in stock car racing today. The engineering behind those Chevelles worked exactly as intended. Driving one of these modified versions, Curtis Turner became the very first driver to qualify at over 180 miles per hour at Daytona. Smokey himself explicitly denied the pure scale model rumor, both in a 1987 Circle Track magazine interview and later in his own autobiography, explaining that his modifications were far more calculated and technical than a simple scaling trick. This fits into a larger pattern that defined Smokey's entire approach to racing. He was constantly living in the gray areas of the rulebook, searching for advantages that were technically legal, or at least not explicitly banned. He famously exploited fuel capacity limits by running 11-foot coils of 2-inch tubing as his fuel line, a clever trick that effectively added roughly 5 extra gallons of usable fuel capacity to a car's total volume. There are countless garage legends surrounding offset chassis setups and cars that mysteriously drove off pit road with empty fuel tanks right after passing inspection. Smokey later wrote about this mindset directly, essentially explaining that he believed everyone else was cheating far worse than he was, so pushing the boundaries himself was simply a form of self-defense in a competitive environment where the rules were rarely enforced evenly.